Pioneers used to entertain themselves by telling scary stories. At night they might gather in somebody's cabin or around a fire and see who could scare the others the most. Some girls and boys in my town do the same thing today. They get together at someone's house and turn out the lights and eat popcorn and scare one another half to death. Telling scary stories is something people have done for thousands of years. For most of us like being scared in that way. Since there isn't any danger, we think it's fun. There are a great many scary stories to tell. There are ghost stories. There are tales of witches, devils, boogeymen, zombies, and vampires. There are tales of monstrous creatures and other dangers. There even are stories that make us laugh at all this scariness. Some of these tales are very old, and they are told around the world, and most have the same origins. They are based on things that people saw or heard or experienced or thought they did. Many years ago, a young prince became famous for a scary story he started to tell, but did not finish. His name was Mamilius, and he probably was 9 or 10 years old. William Shakespeare told about him in The Winter's Tale. It was on a dark winter's day that his mother, the queen, asked him for a story. "A sad tale's best for winter," he said. "I have one of spirits and goblins. Do your best to frighten me with your sprites," she said. "You're powerful at it." "I shall tell it softly," he said. "Yon crickets shall not hear it." He began, "There was a man dwelt by a churchyard." But that was as far as he got, for at that moment the king came and arrested the queen and took her away. And soon after that Mamilius died. No one knows how he would have finished his story. If you started as he did, what would you tell? Most scary stories are, of course, meant to be told. They are more scary that way. But how you tell them is important. As Mamilius knew, the best way is to speak softly, so that your listeners lean forward to catch your words, and to speak slowly, so that your voice sounds scary. And the best time to tell these stories is at night, in the dark and in the gloom. It is easy for someone listening to imagine all sorts of strange and scary things. There was an old woman who lived by herself, and she was very lonely. Sitting in the kitchen one night, she said, "Oh, I wish I had some company." No sooner had she spoken than down the chimney tumbled 2 feet, from which the flesh had rotten. The old woman's eyes bulged with terror. Then 2 legs dropped and attached themselves to the feet. Then a body tumbled down, then 2 arms, and a man's head. As the old woman watched, the parts came together into a great, gangly man. The man danced around and around the room, faster and faster he went. Then he stopped, and he looked into her eyes. "What do you come for?" she asked, in a small voice that shivered and shook. "What do I come for?" he said. "I come for you." My uncle was walking down a lonely dirt road one day. He came upon a man who was also walking down that road. That man looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the man. The man was scared of my uncle, and my uncle was scared of that man. But they kept on walking, and it began to get dark. The man looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the man. The man was very scared of my uncle, and my uncle was very scared of that man. But they kept on walking, and they came to a big woods. It was getting darker, and the man looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the man. The man was really scared of my uncle, and my uncle was really scared of that man. But they kept on walking, and deep down into the woods they went. It was getting darker, and the man looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the man. And the man was terribly scared of my uncle, and my uncle was terribly scared of... A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with his friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night they had a good time visiting. But when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and could not sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car turn into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving in such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse looked up at him. When Blackwell saw his queer, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him. "There's room for one more." Then he waited for a minute or two, and he drove off. Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "I must have been. But it didn't seem like a dream," he said. After breakfast, he went into Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of the new office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting on an elevator to take him down to the street. But when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him. "There's room for one more," he said. It was the driver of the hearse. "No, thank you. I'll get the next one," said Blackwell. The doors closed, and the elevator started down. There was a shrieking and screaming, then the sound of a crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone aboard was killed. One time a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would be scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp. Sat there reading the Bible. Then just before midnight, he heard start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. And there was a lot of thrashing around, struggles, and finally everything got quiet. The old preacher took his Bible again. But before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat, watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up. "What do you want?" The door shut back, easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mend the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went off to shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again. Slowly, step, 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 step. Closer and closer, step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. The knob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time, the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Who are you? And what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room straight to him and took a hold of his coat. It was a young woman about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and her flesh was streaming off her face, so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyes, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets. And she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going, with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of her little finger from her left hand and lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. She said,
"If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church."
The haunt sobbed like she was tired as she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at that bone, trying to get rid of it. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went to that house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the sack of money. And where the haunt had held onto his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out.